The evening was calm when the man's car rolled quietly into the neighborhood, the sun sinking low, painting the sky orange and gold. His business trip had ended sooner than planned, and though tired, he felt a small spark of relief to be home early. He imagined a hot shower, a glass of wine, and silence within the walls of his mansion. The place he had worked so hard to own. As he turned into his long driveway, he slowed down, his brows knitting together. Because something was wrong, the mansion should have been dark, its tall windows usually quiet when he was away. But tonight faint light spilled from the living room curtains. A glow that shouldn't have been there. His chest tightened, confusion washing over him. He had left no lights on, he was sure. His hand tightened on the steering wheel as he parked carefully near the gate. He stepped out slowly, the night air cool, crickets humming in the distance. He stared at the house, the glow steady, not flickering like a timer lamp. This was different. This was lived-in light, and then he noticed it. The faint movement of shadows across the window. Someone was inside. His heart beat heavier, but his face stayed calm. He locked his car softly and walked toward the front door. His shoes crunching against the gravel, each step careful, his eyes sharp, his mind racing. Who could it be? He thought of a possible break-in, maybe trespassers. But nothing made sense. The gates had been secure, the alarms active. Yet here he was, staring at proof that someone had entered. He stopped near the front porch and listened. Faint sounds carried through the door, muffled voices, a laugh, glasses clinking. His jaw tightened. His home, his private sanctuary, sounded like it belonged to someone else. He tried the handle, but the door was locked from the inside. He pulled his keys from his pocket, holding them steady. But before he could insert them, something else caught his attention. The flicker of a curtain upstairs. As if someone had quickly pulled it closed after spotting him. His eyes narrowed. He waited, the silence stretching, and then he saw it again. A shadow moving swiftly across the window. The kind of careless movement that came from someone who thought they owned the place. His lips pressed into a thin line. He stepped back from the door, scanning the mansion, the driveway, the yard, his mind sharp, every detail weighing against the unease growing in his chest. He had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know that nothing stayed secret here. Eyes were always watching, whispers always spreading, and if someone was bold enough to be inside his house with lights on, it had to be someone who thought themselves untouchable. His thoughts paused, one name rising, Karen, the HOA president. The woman who had spent years trying to control every detail of his life, who fined him for grass too tall, who complained about the color of his mailbox, who wrote letters about the length of his driveway. She had always pushed, always threatened, always sought to remind him that she was in charge. His hands clenched, because only someone like her would dare something so bold. He moved back toward the driveway, his phone buzzing faintly in his pocket. But he ignored it, his focus on the house. And then came the sound, tires crunching against gravel, flashing lights reflecting off the windows. 2 police cars pulled up, sirens low but lights spinning red and blue. Officers stepped out quickly, their eyes on him, their hands near their belts. One called out sharply, asking what he was doing here. His heart sank, but his face remained calm. Karen. It had to be her. She had called them. He stood still, raising his hands slowly, his voice steady as he told them it was his house, that he had just returned from a trip. The officers looked doubtful. One asked for ID. The other kept his hand near his holster. And then the mansion door opened wide. Karen stepped out, her red jacket bright even in the flashing lights, her hair neat, her clipboard nowhere to be seen, but her face smug, her lips curled in a smile that dripped poison. She pointed at him dramatically and shouted that he was trespassing, that he had no right to be here, that the owner of the house was away. The officers looked at her, then back at him, confusion flickering in their eyes. Karen's voice grew louder, shriller. She said she had seen him trying to break in, that she called immediately to protect the community. Her words poured out like practiced lies. Neighbors began to emerge from their houses, curious about the flashing lights. Whispers filled the street, people pointing, murmuring. The man kept his calm, his voice steady as he handed over his ID and his house keys. He told the officers this was his property, that his name would match every record. His hands did not shake. His eyes never left Karen. She laughed coldly, waving her arms, telling the officers not to be fooled, that he had probably stolen the documents, that she had been keeping an eye on the mansion because the owner had been gone. The crowd of neighbors leaned closer, watching, waiting. The officers stepped back to check his ID against their system. Their radios crackled softly. Karen's smile faltered slightly. But she covered it with more shouting, accusing him of lying, her voice desperate to fill the air before truth arrived. The man said nothing, his silence heavy, his eyes steady on her, because he knew, deep inside, that the shadows, the lights, the laughter inside his house were no coincidence. Karen had not only called the cops on him, she had been inside, living in his mansion, enjoying what was never hers, and though she still shouted, though the officers still questioned, though the neighbors still whispered, the truth was already beginning to rise, and the calm man at the center of the storm stood unbroken, waiting for her empire of lies to collapse under the weight of silence and evidence. The officers stepped closer, their flashlights cutting across the driveway. The man stood calmly, his hands steady at his sides, his ID already given, his keys gleaming faintly in the light. He spoke in a low, clear voice, telling them again this was his home. But before they could respond, Karen's shrill voice sliced through the night. She marched down the front steps of the mansion, her red jacket glowing under the flashing police lights, her face twisted with false outrage. She pointed her finger at him dramatically and shouted that he was an intruder, that she had caught him trying to break into the mansion. Neighbors gasped, some whispering, others clutching their children closer as they watched from porches and lawns. Karen spoke louder, her words tumbling over each other. She told the officers the house was empty, that the owner had been gone for weeks, that this man was trying to claim what wasn't his. Her voice was strong, but her eyes flickered nervously toward the upstairs window where shadows still moved. The man noticed, his gaze narrowing, but he said nothing. The officers turned back to him, one asking where he had been, why he returned without notice. He answered steadily, explaining his business trip, explaining how he had come back early, his voice calm, his tone unshaken. But Karen interrupted again, her words sharp, accusing him of fabricating stories, mocking his calmness, telling the officers that criminals always sounded confident until they were caught. Her laughter rang hollow in the heavy air. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One held his radio close, murmuring into it, checking his ID. The other kept his eyes fixed on him. Karen stepped closer, her finger nearly stabbing the man's chest as she hissed that she had seen him trying to force the lock. She called herself a responsible president protecting the community. She bragged that she had acted quickly, saving the neighborhood from a dangerous trespasser. Her words were designed for the crowd as much as for the police. Her performance a show of control. Neighbors whispered louder, some doubtful, some too afraid to speak. The man did not move, his silence heavier than her noise. He watched her carefully, every exaggerated gesture, every twitch of her smile. She thrived on attention, on drama. But he knew her arrogance was covering fear. The officers asked for proof of ownership. His calm hands reached into his folder and produced documents, bills, and identification, all with his name and address. The officers' flashlights scanned the pages, their brows furrowed. Karen lunged forward, her voice screeching that the documents were forged, that he had probably stolen them. She clung to the lie like a drowning woman clings to a rope, her voice trembling even as she shouted. The crowd saw the crack, her power slipping. Neighbors who once obeyed her without question now exchanged looks of disbelief. One man muttered under his breath that something wasn't right. Karen heard it. Her face flushed. She barked louder, demanding the police arrest him immediately, demanding they cuff him. Her words wild, but the officers hesitated. The documents in their hands carried more weight than her shouting. One officer finally asked her how she knew so much about the mansion if the owner had been gone. The question pierced her confidence. She stuttered for a heartbeat, then quickly claimed she had been keeping watch, protecting the property, her excuse flimsy, her voice cracking. The neighbors noticed. Whispers spread faster. Children giggled softly, their parents shushing them. The man stayed silent, his eyes steady. He let her unravel. The officers stepped back, radioing for confirmation. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Karen's sharp breathing and the distant sound of water lapping at the lake. When the confirmation came back that the documents matched the owner's name and records, the officers' faces shifted, their suspicion no longer aimed at him. Karen paled, her mouth opening and closing. She shouted again that there must be a mistake, that the system was wrong, her voice more desperate now, less commanding. The crowd saw it. They saw her shrinking, they saw her mask cracking, but still she tried to fill the air with noise. Still she tried to hold power that was slipping through her fingers. The man remained calm, his silence stronger than her screams. And though the night was filled with her accusations, Though the officers still questioned, everyone who stood there could feel the truth rising, heavy, undeniable, that the man belonged in the mansion. And Karen's lies were about to collapse in front of everyone. Watching. The flashing lights from the police cars painted the mansion walls red and blue. Neighbors gathered in clusters at the end of the driveway, whispering nervously, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Karen stood tall in her red jacket, her voice sharp and loud, telling anyone who would listen that she had caught a criminal breaking into the mansion. She called him dangerous, she called him a liar. She told the officers they needed to act quickly before he caused trouble. But the man stayed calm, his documents still in the officer's hands, his car keys glinting faintly under the lights. His silence was steady, his breathing slow. He watched Karen carefully, every frantic movement, every exaggerated word. He knew she was hiding something. He could feel it in the way her eyes darted toward the mansion windows when she thought no one was looking. The officers asked him more questions, their tone cautious. They wanted to be sure. They asked when he had left for his trip, when he had returned, why the lights were on if he had been away. He answered simply, each reply quiet but clear. He explained his flight, his hotel, even showed his boarding pass saved on his phone. The details neat and precise. Karen interrupted, her laughter sharp. She mocked his calmness, calling it an act, saying anyone could fake papers and stories. Her words rushed, desperate to keep control of the moment. But then one officer shined his light toward the upstairs window. The curtain shifted again, just a twitch, small but visible. The officer frowned, asking if anyone else was inside. The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. He said quietly that he wouldn't know. Since he had just returned, Karen's face tightened, her lips pressing into a shaky smile. She said quickly that maybe squatters had broken in, that she had been trying to protect the house by reporting him. Her excuse was weak, her voice trembling beneath her forced confidence. The neighbors leaned closer, their whispers rising. Some asked each other why Karen seemed so invested, why she was speaking as though she owned the mansion herself. The man said nothing, but he noticed details, the way the living room curtains were pulled unevenly, the faint glow of a lamp he never left on, the outline of glasses on the side table through the window, details that shouted of someone living inside. His chest tightened but his face remained calm. He waited, letting Karen bury herself deeper. The officers grew more uneasy. One stepped to the door and knocked firmly, calling out for anyone inside. There was no answer, but faint movement could be heard, a muffled thump like hurried footsteps. Karen spoke quickly, saying it was just the house settling, her laugh forced, her hands twitching. The officer glanced at her sharply, suspicion rising. The man did not speak. He let silence do the work. The crowd grew restless, some neighbors shaking their heads, some crossing their arms, their eyes shifting between Karen's frantic energy and the man's quiet calmness. The contrast was striking. One shouted quietly from the back asking why Karen was so desperate. She snapped at him to stay quiet, her voice breaking. She turned back to the officers, insisting again that the man was an intruder. But her voice sounded thinner now, less certain. The officers stepped aside and asked the man if he had a key. He nodded calmly, producing it from his pocket. The metal glinted in the flashing lights. Karen's face drained. She lunged forward, shouting that it didn't prove anything, that keys could be copied, her words wild, almost frantic. But the officer ignored her. Sliding the key into the lock, it turned smoothly, the door opening with a soft creak. The crowd gasped. Karen stumbled back a step, her face pale, her smile frozen. The officer shined his light into the living room, and what it revealed made the whispers explode into gasps. The furniture was disturbed, cushions out of place, wine glasses on the table, blankets draped over the couch, signs of life everywhere. This was no empty house. Someone had been living here. The officer looked back at the man, his brow furrowed. The man's face remained calm, his silence unbroken. Karen laughed again, too loud, saying quickly that maybe squatters had broken in, maybe it was vandals. She claimed she had been watching the place to protect it. Her excuses tripped over each other, her words frantic, her eyes wide. But the neighbors saw through her. The officers saw through her. The man only watched her quietly, his gaze cold, because every strange detail confirmed what he had already suspected. Karen had not just called the police to frame him. She had been inside his mansion, living in his home, enjoying what was not hers, and though she still shouted, though she still twisted lies, her voice was cracking, her control slipping. the truth beginning to shine through the cracks like light breaking into a dark room. The door stood open now, the soft creak of its hinges still echoing in the tense air. The officers stepped carefully into the living room, their flashlights cutting across the space. The crowd of neighbors leaned closer from the driveway, whispering louder than before. The man followed slowly behind them, his steps steady, his face calm, his silence thick, but his eyes sharp, scanning every detail. The smell of perfume lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the scent of wine. The table carried 2 empty glasses, one tipped on its side with a red stain seeping into the wood. Cushions lay scattered as if someone had lounged carelessly. A blanket hung over the back of the couch. These were not signs of an empty house. These were signs of someone living. Karen stood at the doorway, her smile stiff, her voice shrill as she called out excuses. She told the officers this was just the work of squatters, teenagers maybe. She said she had been keeping an eye on the place to protect it. Her words tumbled out quickly, desperate to fill the silence before anyone could think too deeply. But the silence around her was growing heavier, because the neighbors were not nodding in agreement like they once did. They were staring, their faces tight with suspicion. The officers ignored her for the moment, shining their lights across the walls, and then it happened. One of them tilted his beam upward, catching a flicker of movement from the staircase. A shadow retreating quickly behind the wall. The man's eyes narrowed, his chest tightening. He said nothing, but he saw it clearly. Someone else was upstairs, someone who didn't belong. One officer called out firmly, demanding that anyone inside come down. The house fell silent again. But faint sounds followed, hurried footsteps, a door clicking shut. Karen's laugh came too quickly, too loud. She said it was nothing, maybe just the old wood shifting. She insisted the house had always creaked, but her voice cracked mid-sentence, her eyes betraying panic as they darted toward the stairs. The man noticed it instantly, that nervous flicker, that twitch of fear she could not hide. It was the first clue, the confirmation he had been waiting for. He let the silence stretch, letting her squirm. The neighbors noticed too, their whispers sharper now, some asking each other why Karen kept looking upstairs, why she seemed so desperate, why she acted as if she had something to lose. The officers weren't blind either. One of them exchanged a glance with the other, then stepped toward the staircase, his hand resting on his holster. Karen lunged forward, shouting that it wasn't necessary, that they should focus on the man instead. She waved her arms wildly, trying to pull their attention back to him. But it didn't work. Her movements were too frantic, her tone too desperate. The calm man stood quietly by the door, his eyes on her, watching her crumble under the weight of her own lies. She turned toward him suddenly, pointing her finger again, accusing him of staging everything, saying he had planted squatters just to frame her. But her voice was shaking, her words unconvincing. The officer ignored her and stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned under his weight, and from above came another sound, a muffled thump, hurried movement. As if someone was trying to hide, the crowd gasped, children clutched their parents, neighbors shook their heads, their whispers rising like waves. Karen's face turned red, sweat gleaming on her forehead, her hands trembling at her sides. She tried to laugh again, but it came out hollow, her excuses crumbling faster than she could rebuild them. The man didn't move, his silence pressed against her harder than the officer's flashlight. He let her drown in the moment. He let the truth inch closer, because he already knew, the shadows, the voices, the laughter he had heard before the police arrived, all of it pointed in one direction. Karen had not just called the police to humiliate him. She had been living in his mansion, making herself comfortable, treating it as her own, and now the first clue had slipped, the twitch of a curtain, the nervous glance toward the stairs, the hurried footsteps of someone hiding where they didn't belong. Karen's empire of lies was cracking, and though she screamed louder, though she clawed at control, the weight of silence and evidence was dragging her down step by step. The officer's boots creaked louder on the stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows above. The entire crowd of neighbors stood frozen in the driveway, their whispers dying into silence, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Karen fidgeted at the bottom of the steps, her hands twisting together, her voice snapping suddenly as she told the officer there was no need to go upstairs. She insisted it was dangerous. She shouted that the man had staged intruders to frame her. Her words rushed, frantic, spilling out like water from a broken pipe. But her excuses only drew more suspicion. The man stood calmly by the doorway, his eyes steady, his silence suffocating her every attempt to cover the truth. Then came the sound, A sudden loud thump from above, followed by the hurried slam of a door. The officer froze halfway up the stairs. His light aimed at the hallway above. He called out firmly for whoever was inside to come down immediately. The house fell silent again. But the silence was worse, tense and heavy. The kind that told everyone someone was hiding. Karen laughed too. Loudly, her voice shrill. She waved her arms and said it was nothing. Just an old house making noise, but her laughter cracked, breaking halfway. The neighbors shook their heads. Their whispers grew again. Some muttered that she was lying. Others asked why she was so desperate to stop the officer from going upstairs. The second officer moved toward the kitchen while the first continued up the stairs, their flashlights glinting off polished wood and scattered objects. Because the house was not empty, it was lived in. Magazines were spread across the coffee table. Shoes lay near the entryway, and faint music played from somewhere deeper inside. Music that should not have been there. When the officer reached the top step, he pushed the hallway door open and the light revealed the shocking truth. A suitcase half open on the floor, women's clothing draped over a chair, jewelry scattered on the dresser. A glass of half-finished wine sitting on the nightstand beside the master bed. The bed itself unmade as if someone had just risen from it. The officer called. For his partner, his voice sharp, his light sweeping across the walls. Karen gasped loudly from below, her face drained of color. She shouted that it was squatters. She screamed that vandals had broken in. But the neighbors could hear the panic in her voice now. The kind that no longer sounded like control but like fear. The second officer opened the refrigerator and found it stocked with fresh food. Milk not expired, fruit still firm. Leftovers packed neatly in containers. Proof that someone had been eating there daily. He pulled open the pantry, finding bags of groceries with dates from just days ago. Karen stumbled forward, her hands shaking as she grabbed at his arm, telling him not to be fooled, that it meant nothing. But he pulled away coldly, his suspicion heavy. The man stayed by the doorway, silent, watching her unravel. His eyes calm as steel. He did not need to argue, he did not need to shout. Because the house was speaking for him. Every corner filled with evidence. Every room screaming of her lies. The officer upstairs called again, his voice firm, telling whoever was hiding to come out. Still silence. Still the sound of shuffling feet behind a locked door. The neighbors gasped, some covering their mouths, children clutching their parents tighter. The officer tested the knob, locked. He banged the door hard, demanding it be opened. A faint whimper answered from inside, soft, nervous, guilty. Karen shouted desperately, saying no one was there, her voice shrill and trembling, her lies collapsing with every second. The officer forced the door open and the flashlight flooded the room, revealing blankets tossed carelessly on the floor, shoes kicked aside, and an open laptop glowing faintly on the desk. The screen showing HOA documents, spreadsheets, even messages addressed to Karen. The neighbors outside gasped in shock, their whispers exploding, some calling out her name. Their voices filled with disbelief and anger. The officer's voice came down the stairs, sharp, heavy. He said clearly that someone had been living in the mansion. Not for a night, not for a day, but for days, maybe weeks. The crowd erupted, some laughing in disbelief, some shaking their heads in disgust. Karen's face turned ghostly pale, her legs shaking. She tried to shout again, tried to deny, but the words choked in her throat. Her hands clutched her jacket as if it could shield her from the truth. The man finally stepped further into the living room, his silence more powerful than any accusation. He looked at her, his calm eyes cutting through her panic, and though he did not speak, the truth was clear. She had not just called the police to frame him. She had been living in his house, using his furniture, eating his food, sleeping in his bed, pretending his life was hers. And now every neighbor, every officer, every witness had seen it with their own eyes. Her empire of arrogance had been shattered in the place she thought she had claimed, and no amount of shouting could ever put it back together. The house no longer looked like an empty mansion waiting for its owner. It looked like someone's home, someone who had been living here comfortably while the man was away. The officers moved carefully from room to room, their flashlights cutting across walls and furniture. Every beam revealed another detail, another piece of evidence that made the truth impossible to ignore. In the kitchen, the refrigerator was full of fresh groceries, eggs and milk bought only days ago, vegetables still crisp, meat neatly wrapped. The pantry shelves lined with cereal boxes and snacks, none of it spoiled, none of it old, the kind of food someone ate daily. On the counter sat a half-empty bottle of wine with 2 glasses beside it. The red stain still wet. Karen's lipstick mark on one rim. Upstairs the officer pulled open drawers and found women's clothes folded inside. Expensive dresses and shoes tossed in corners. Not packed away like a visitor, but spread out like the room belonged to her. In the master bathroom, makeup bottles stood in a neat line. Perfume sprayed into the air, towels damp and hanging over the rack. The neighbors at the door gasped when they saw the officer bring down a laptop from the desk. Its screen glowing with HOA files, spreadsheets, and emails, all logged into Karen's account, her name flashing across the top corner. The officer asked her calmly how her personal documents ended up on the man's computer. Her mouth opened but no words came. She stammered, her voice breaking. She muttered that it was a setup, that he had planted them there to frame her. But the crowd was not convinced. Their whispers rose louder, anger building in their voices. Some muttered that she had always been arrogant, that she thought she owned everything. Now they saw she had taken what wasn't hers. The second officer pulled out his phone and checked the locks. The alarm system showed it had been disabled with a master code. The man's code, which only he should have known. But the logs showed multiple entries. Someone had been entering daily, and not once did Karen report a break-in. Not once did she call the man to tell him something was wrong. Her story unraveled piece by piece. The officer held up the log records. His brow furrowed as he asked her to explain. Karen's face flushed. Her hands shook. She shouted that she had been protecting the property, that she had been guarding it. But her voice trembled with panic. She said she had entered to make sure it was safe, but the evidence spoke louder. The unmade bed, the personal clothes, the groceries, the wine, the laptop with her files. It was not protection. It was possession. The neighbors whispered louder, some laughing bitterly, some shaking their heads, their fear of her evaporating into anger. She had called the police to frame him. But she was the intruder. She was the fraud. The man stood by the doorway, calm as stone, his folder still tucked under his arm, his silence more powerful than her shouting. His eyes locked on her with quiet certainty. He didn't need to say a word. Every detail of the house told the story for him. The officers exchanged glances, their suspicion now fully turned. One pulled out a notepad, jotting down details. The other spoke into his radio, calling for backup. Karen panicked. She lunged forward, shouting that they couldn't believe him, that he was lying, that everything had been staged. But her words cracked under the weight of the evidence. Her neighbors' stares cut into her pride, their voices filled with disbelief. One shouted angrily that she had fined him for years while she herself broke the law. Another said loudly that she had always acted like she owned the place. Now they saw she actually tried. Karen screamed at them to shut up, her voice shrill, desperate. But it was useless. The tide had turned. Her empire of fear was collapsing. And all the while the man said nothing. He let the silence and the evidence bury her. He let her lies collapse under their own weight. Because now the truth was undeniable. The HOA president, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, had been secretly living in a mansion that never belonged to her, and there was no escape left from the proof that filled every corner of the house. The silence in the mansion grew heavier as the officers finished moving through each room. Every corner carried proof that someone had been living there, the refrigerator full of food, the clothes in drawers, the laptop glowing with Karen's personal files, even the faint smell of her perfume lingering in the air. The neighbors outside whispered louder, their voices sharp, their eyes wide, and the truth weighed on them all. Karen had not caught a criminal. She had been caught herself. The man stood still in the doorway, his posture calm, his silence unbroken, his eyes locked on her, and when he finally stepped forward into the living room, the crowd shifted, all eyes turning to him. Karen backed up a step, her confidence cracking, her hands shaking though. She tried to hide it, her mouth opened to speak but no words came. Then he spoke at last, his voice low, steady, sharp as glass. He asked her simply how long she had been living in his mansion. The question struck like a hammer. The neighbors gasped. Their whispers exploded. The officers turned their eyes to Karen, waiting for her answer. But her lips trembled, her face pale, her words stuck in her throat. She stammered finally, muttering that she had not, that it wasn't true, that she had only entered to protect the house, but her excuses fell flat. The man's calm gaze cut through her like fire, his silence between each word heavier than her frantic denials. He repeated the question again, his tone unchanged, asking how long she had stayed there, and the stillness of his voice made her shrink, her shoulders slumping, her clipboard clutched tight against her chest like a shield. The officers stepped closer, one of them writing in his notepad, the other asking her directly if she wanted to explain why her clothes and files were inside. She snapped suddenly, her voice breaking into a scream. She shouted that it was all fake, that he had planted everything to ruin her. Her finger shot out toward him, her face twisted with rage. But the neighbors laughed bitterly, shaking their heads. They had seen enough. Her lies were too obvious, her desperation too clear. One man called out from the crowd asking if she thought they were blind. Another woman said loudly that Karen had been seen near the mansion many nights, her voice shaking with anger now, accusing her of using the house like her own. Karen shouted back at them, screaming at the crowd to stay quiet, calling them ungrateful, her voice shrill. But no one lowered their eyes this time, no one stepped back. They stared at her with open defiance, their fear of her finally broken. The man remained calm. He did not raise his voice, he did not insult her, he only asked once more, quiet but steady, how long she had been living in his home. His words pressed against her like chains, her eyes darted wildly, sweat dripping down her face. She shouted that she hadn't, that it was all a mistake. But the officers did not look convinced. They turned back to him, asking if he had proof of how long she had been there. He nodded once, calm, and pulled another paper from his folder. The security logs, neat and detailed, showing the door codes entered daily for the past 2 weeks. The same 2 weeks he had been away. The officers scanned it with their flashlights, their brows furrowed deeper. The crowd gasped again. Karen's voice broke into a sob. She shouted that he was lying, that the system could be hacked. But even as she screamed, her voice shook, her hands trembled. The neighbors saw it. The officers saw it. The man stayed silent, his calmness sharper than any blade. Karen's voice grew weaker, her body trembling as she stepped back toward the wall, her eyes wide, her breath ragged. And in that moment, everyone saw it clearly. The queen of the HOA, the woman who ruled with fines and threats, was cornered in the very house she tried to steal. Her lies stripped away, her pride shattered, her power gone. And the calm man she had mocked stood silent, his stillness louder than her endless noise. The living room was silent except for Karen's ragged breathing, her face pale, her eyes darting between the officers, the neighbors at the door, and the calm man standing like stone. The officers flipped through the security log papers in their hands, each line marked with timestamps, each entry showing the code entered again and again, not once or twice, but every single day for the last 2 weeks. One officer asked quietly if he had proof he had been away during that time. The man nodded once, calm, and produced travel receipts, hotel records, and boarding passes, each page carefully organized, each one stamped with dates matching the security logs. The officer scanned them, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. The truth was undeniable. The man had been gone. The house had not been empty. Someone else had been inside, living as though it belonged to them. Karen's knees trembled. She tried to laugh but the sound cracked halfway. She stammered quickly, saying he must have faked it, that the documents were forged, her voice sharp but weak. The neighbors shook their heads, some whispering louder now. One woman said she had seen lights on every night for the past week. Another man said he had noticed Karen's car parked near the mansion more than once. Their words cut into her like knives. The crowd that once feared her was now openly turning against her. The officer upstairs came down carrying the laptop, its screen glowing. He placed it on the table and turned it for all to see. The files open, HOA letters written and signed by Karen, dated during the man's trip. Proof she had been working from his desk, using his space as her office. The neighbors gasped, their whispers exploding into open voices, some laughing in disbelief, others muttering angrily that she had abused her position. Karen lunged forward, slamming the laptop shut, her voice cracking as she shouted it was planted, that it wasn't hers. But everyone had seen her name on the screen, everyone had seen the truth. The second officer pulled a small pile of unopened mail from the counter, all addressed to the man, with dates from the last 2 weeks, still sealed, untouched. Karen's face twisted as she tried to explain, saying she had been protecting the mail from thieves. But her excuses sounded desperate now, hollow. One officer asked her firmly why her clothes were in the master bedroom, why her perfume was in the bathroom, why her groceries were in the fridge, why her fingerprints would likely be all over the glasses of wine. Karen's mouth opened but no words came. She stuttered, her hands shaking, sweat dripping down her forehead. The neighbors began laughing openly, bitter laughs that carried years of pent-up resentment. Some shouted angrily, calling her a fraud, calling her a thief. One man raised his voice, saying she had fined him hundreds for a broken fence. Yet here she was stealing a mansion. Another woman shouted that Karen had once threatened to evict her for a lawn ornament, and now she had broken every rule herself. The officers finally turned to Karen and told her to sit down, their voices stern, no longer respectful. She froze, her eyes wide, her body trembling. She tried to shout again, saying she was the president of the HOA, that she had authority. But the words sounded pathetic now, meaningless. Her power dissolved, her throne crumbled. The man stood silently in the corner, his eyes steady, his calmness louder than the chaos. He did not gloat, he did not smile, he let the evidence bury her. He let the truth crush her lies. Karen stumbled backward into a chair, collapsing into it, her hands clutching her jacket tightly, her face red, her chest rising and falling in panic. The officers continued writing in their notepads, noting every detail, every piece of evidence. Karen's voice cracked as she begged them to believe her. But no one did. The neighbors had seen everything. The officers had seen everything. The man had revealed everything without raising his voice. The full exposure had arrived. Her secrets dragged into the open. Her lies shattered in front of everyone she once ruled, and though she still muttered denials, though she still tried to cling to her pride, it was finished. She had been caught living in the mansion that never belonged to her, caught in front of police, caught in front of neighbors, caught in front of the man whose silence had destroyed her, and nothing she said now could change the truth that lay in every corner of the house. The night stretched heavier as the officers finished their inspection. The neighbors no longer whispered but spoke openly, their voices carrying anger and disbelief across the yard. The once untouchable HOA president sat hunched in a chair in the living room, her red jacket wrinkled, her hair clinging to her damp forehead, her eyes darting nervously between the officers and the man standing silently in the doorway. The man had not spoken since presenting his proof, his calmness pressing harder than chains, his silence suffocating every excuse Karen tried to throw into the air. One officer finally stepped forward, his notebook full of details, his voice firm as he told Karen she was now under investigation for trespassing, fraud, and misuse of authority. The words struck her like a slap, her head jerked up, her mouth falling open. She screamed suddenly, her voice shrill, demanding they arrest him instead, demanding they throw him in jail. But her words rang hollow. The officers ignored her, turning instead to the man and thanking him for his cooperation. The neighbors outside erupted in murmurs, some cheering quietly, others shaking their heads in disgust at Karen's downfall. Her reign had ended not with a fine or a rule, but with her own humiliation. Karen leapt to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She shouted that she was the president of the HOA, that her position gave her protection, that they could not treat her this way. Her voice cracked, the desperation clear. The officer did not flinch, he told her calmly that no title placed her above the law, his words heavy, cutting through her arrogance like a blade. The neighbors clapped suddenly, their applause rising through the night air, sharp and defiant. Karen froze, her eyes wide as she realized the same people who once bowed to her now celebrated her fall. She screamed at them to stop, calling them ungrateful, her words trembling. But they only clapped louder, her face burned red, her chest heaving. She turned back to the man, pointing a shaking finger at him, calling him a liar, a criminal. But he did not answer. His silence only deepened her humiliation. The officers asked him quietly if he wanted to press charges. He nodded once, calm. The crowd gasped again, because everyone knew what that meant. This was not just embarrassment. This was justice. Karen's lips trembled. She begged suddenly, her voice breaking. She said it was all a misunderstanding. She promised to resign. She promised to leave him alone, her tone pathetic. Now, nothing like the proud queen she once played. The officers wrote down her words but continued with the report, their pens scratching louder than her pleas. One officer called dispatch, his voice low and calm as he requested a squad car to process her statement formally. The red and blue lights flickered brighter, reflecting off her pale face. Karen slumped into the chair again, her hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. The neighbors shouted insults now, years of resentment spilling out. They called her a thief, a fraud, a bully. One man yelled that she had fined him for flowers in his yard. Another shouted that she had threatened to tow his car for parking too close to the curb. Now they laughed at her. Their laughter cruel but filled with freedom. Their fear gone. Karen's tears spilled, her face crumpling as the weight of it crushed her. Her power gone, her pride shattered, her empire dissolved. The man stood silently, watching her, his calm eyes steady, his silence louder than the laughter outside, louder than the police radio's crackling, louder than Karen's broken cries. The legal blow had fallen, and nothing could save her now. The HOA president had become the criminal. The queen had been stripped to nothing, and the man had not needed to lift a hand or raise his voice. The law had spoken, the neighbors had seen, and the truth had buried her completely. The night had ended in a way no one in the neighborhood could have imagined. The flashing police lights slowly faded as the cars pulled away. Karen sat in the back of one, her red jacket crumpled, her head bowed low, her hands trembling against her lap. For years she had strutted through the streets with that same jacket like it was a crown. But now it looked like a costume ripped away. The neighbors stood scattered across the lawns, some still whispering, some laughing openly, some shaking their heads as if they still couldn't believe what they had witnessed. The queen of fines and threats, the woman who had ruled them with fear, had been exposed and dragged away not by shouting or violence, but by her own arrogance and lies. The man stood at the edge of his driveway, silent, his folder still tucked under his arm. He did not wave, he did not smile, he did not speak. He only stood watching until the last police car disappeared down the street. The neighbors turned their eyes to him then. The same people who once avoided his gaze now looked at him with respect, admiration, even gratitude. One by one they began to call out softly, some saying thank you, some nodding, some clapping, their voices carrying warmth instead of fear. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves and pointed at him with wide eyes, whispering to each other that he had stopped Karen without yelling, without fighting, only with silence. He did not answer. He simply nodded once, his calmness heavier than words. The crowd grew louder, their cheers rising, not chaotic but steady, like a tide washing away years of fear. Karen's house sat dark across the street, her windows closed, her empire gone, her voice silenced. She would not be returning as queen of this neighborhood again. Her reign had ended the moment truth had been exposed inside his mansion. The neighbors began to celebrate quietly, some walking toward the lake, some gathering near each other with relief on their faces. They felt free for the first time in years. No fines hanging over them, no threats lurking in their mailboxes. The man finally turned and walked slowly up the steps to his porch. The sound of his shoes on the stone path the only noise he made. He paused once at the door, turning slightly to look at the crowd, his face calm, his eyes steady. The neighbors hushed again, waiting, but he said nothing. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, leaving silence in his wake. Yet that silence was not empty. It was powerful, heavier than speeches, louder than any victory chant. It carried more weight than all of Karen's years of shouting. The neighbors stood there, realizing that they had seen something unforgettable. That arrogance could be crushed without screaming, that lies could collapse under truth, that sometimes silence itself was the sharpest weapon. Over the next days the neighborhood changed. People painted their houses the colors they wanted. Children played in the yards without fear. Families laughed louder, freer. They no longer glanced over their shoulders expecting Karen to appear with her clipboard. They no longer feared HOA letters stuffed in their mailboxes. Life blossomed in ways it never had. Under her rule, and through it all the man remained the same, calm, quiet, steady, walking sometimes by the lake, sometimes down the street, never boasting, never reminding anyone of what he had done. He didn't need to, because everyone remembered. They remembered the night the police came, the night the evidence spoke, the night Karen's lies collapsed, and the night his silence drowned her noise. Karen's name became nothing but a bitter story neighbors told each other when they wanted to remember the past, but the man's silence became legend, a story parents told their children. That one night a man defeated a tyrant not by fighting, not by shouting, but by standing calm, by letting truth and silence speak for him. And as the years passed the mansion stood brighter, the lake shimmered freer, and the neighborhood lived stronger, forever changed by the night of his silent victory.